Welcome back for episode 23 of the Astronomical Apocrypha, the Seleukid Empire narrative Let's Play for Rome II with Divide et Impera. Last time the Romans made their second attempt at an invasion across the Adriatic, Legio III filling the void left by Legio VI and VII. With the naval engagement all but concluded, a small ship of archer marines brought the conflict blazing back to life as they sailed circles around the clumsy Roman ships. Though eventually trapped and destroyed by a ship full of velites, the archers managed to inflict an exponential number of casualties in proportion to their tiny skeleton crew, and the sacrifice of Cineas and the garrison navy gave Antigonos Doson the edge he needed to win the fight and drive the Legio III back in disgrace. Legio III, rejuvenated and replenished after returning to Italy for over a year, marched up the Italian peninsula to attempt to recapture Patavium, but again the Goliath Roman legion was destroyed, this time by the lowly slings of a few Jewish levy soldiers. Antiochus Hierax finally arrived in Liguria with his mother Laodice and her new paramour, the Roman defector Spurius Titinius. Hierax defeated the Insubris and destroyed their stronghold city of Medlon in the foothills of the Alps, making a pretentious display of feigned indignation at his father Antiochus Theos's death, before quickly turning his attention southward to the conquest of Italia and the capture of his father's widow, the Ptolemaic princess Berenike, and her young son Antiochus.
I'm sorry, but you cannot come into the Curia, citizens.
But this is a public forum.
I understand, but precautions are now being taken as the agents of Antiochus are feared to have infiltrated the region, perhaps even the city. Even now, the senators are debating the passage of Senatus Consultum Ultimum that will elevate the magistrate to dictator.
In that case, tell the magistrate we must speak with him. It's a matter of urgency.
Tell me about the matter, and I will make an inquiry on your behalf.
A woman and her child, fleeing from Medlon, have just been admitted to the city. Her clothes are in tatters, but she still has with her the headdress bearing the Ptolemaic eagle.
You come with me. We'll notify the Senate and the magistrate, although I expect this will only speed the passage of their resolution. You two go get Berenike and her son, and bring them directly here. Ensure her safety. Your lives depend on it.
Our first order of business here is an acknowledgement paid by Dymas to the Jewish slingers who salvaged the battle at Patavium. I would exempt Jerusalem from tax, but it would entail detaxing all of Nabatea, so instead they receive a nominal thanks in the form of an honorary new name for Antiochus Theos's old army, the Thunderbolts of Zeus, of which I'm sure he wouldn't approve. A fitting if ironic twist given the Temple of Zeus he built in Jerusalem. Eurydice tried all of last episode to convince Faustus Lollius Messala to defect, although he proved resilient to her charms and threats. But this time he finally gives in to a coerced action, and we have yet another Roman on the agent roster. Denia has moved deeper into the formerly Carthaginian but now Roman territories of northern Africa, finding Legio I sequestered at the port of Thapsos. However, they are already aboard their ships and preparing to sail as we see in the intern phase, the fleet of transports moving north towards Syracuse. The Pergamon garrison continues to deal with the incredibly recalcitrant Pergamon people who have risen up once again, but again easily defeated by the adequate military presence Sophocles has left in place. Eurydice's finale to her triumphant triumvirate trifecta of defectors ends sadly with her own finale as our longtime and very first spy finally dies of natural causes at the beginning of 231 BC. she's replaced by the incredibly green, incredibly inadequate level 1 Doris, who will struggle to fill the shoes of the original, although she evidently paints self-portraits in her spare time, so enamored she is with herself. Hierax departs from Medlon with his intent to begin his Italian conquest, although first he must make a brief detour into Genua to eliminate the Roman presence in Cisalpina before advancing into the peninsula. We're faced by a large but low-quality garrison against whom we hold every advantage, and a clear chance for victory on the balance bar. Unfortunately, however, like many battles you'll see in this episode, the circumstances dictate a manual assault, due to the unacceptably high number of casualties expected in the auto-resolve. I wasn't sure if the Romans would respond in the usual fashion to a settlement assault, so I set up a two-pronged attack with a small detachment of shield-bearers and silver-shield swordsmen at the eastern periphery of town, while the main attack commanded by Hierax is made by a Lithobolus engine shielded behind a pair of silver-shield phalanges. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the strategy is overkill, as the Romans, like many fallen civilizations before them, come pouring out of town in a single-minded attempt to reach the ballista, and in the process subject themselves to being surrounded by Hierax's extremely deadly infantry. The Romans suffer a hail of flaming shot and flaming arrows as the skirmish cavalry move up on the western flank to hurl their javelins, and I begin pulling back my flanking detachment to reach the enemy rear. A few units give chase around the edges of our horseshoe-shaped formation, threatening to envelop their counterattack, but they're either met and now overpowered by the resolute shield-bearers and silver shields on the left, or the furious power of the elephants on the right. One of my silver shield sword regiments suffers a bit, as they take on a quarter of the garrison by themselves, but these Roman troops just aren't the quality we've seen from their legions, and they can't handle the flanking attacks of the cavalry, the unremitting missile barrage, the martial skill of the silver shields, or the ferocity of Antigonos, and one by one their regiments waver and then crumple under the pressure of the Seleukid onslaught. Quintus Carbo, the garrison commander, is, to his credit, the last of his men to admit defeat, but he only lasts a few more seconds, and then Antiochus Hierax has claimed Liguria as his own. It wasn't a picture-perfect battle, but even so, a 10-to-1 kill ratio was far better than what we were promised in the auto-resolve, and this necessary distraction will allow Hierax to sustain his assault into the Roman heartland. Genua is a Tier 3 settlement, and so the high cost of conversion of its city center along with an upgrade to Medlon's Seleukid infrastructure will take much of our wealth for this turn. Pausanias sails with the heralds of Triton towards Syracuse to scout the Roman presence there, and possibly cut off any attempt by Legio I to reach the European continent. Diogenes, who I fear will never reach Roman territory before he dies of old age, finally crosses into the western Kyrene-held portion of Libya, while Seleukos II makes his way into allied Arsi territory at Samander, making a brief but unwelcome passage through Scythian lands as he does so. Hermocrates maintains his watch at Pantikapaon, a somewhat precarious perch at the top of the Black Sea, with potentially hostile tribes to the north, east, and west, and while he remains there, I replace Eualcidas' light Loncophoroi cavalry with most of the rest of my income for the turn. The Romans respond to Pausanias' expedition to Syracuse with an aggressive and preemptive attack, the Legio I transport fleet assisted by the Classis IV professional navy. We're given no hope of winning this one on the balance bar, and though I'm tempted to give it a try based on our success with the garrison navy last episode, I decide the prudent course of action is to withdraw. There's a threat of rebellion in both Bosporus and Cisalpine Gaul, but fortunately both locations are well garrisoned and administrated for the moment. Our new spy Doris tries her own coercion effort on the remaining Roman governor in the area, Tiberius Calpurnius, hoping to dispel the incipient rebellion in one act, but succeeds only in hindering his actions. Antiochus Hierax moves down the southeastern road from Genua to the border of Cisalpina, with Italia, the river Arno, only a few days' march away. Pausanias' safe retreat has left the way open for his return to the waters around Syracuse, where Legio I remain aboard their transports. Though I've moved his ally Chilon in the hopes of adding his fleet's strength to the engagement, it isn't necessary, as the moderately large heralds of Triton are easily more than a match for the transports of Legio I, even with the adjacent garrison navy of Syracuse. In part due to the gutting of Antiochos Theos' army, we still have excellent income, and part of this I'm devoting to fleshing out my far eastern forces, starting with Antilochus' Jaws of Tiamat, adding some Indo-Iranian troops to the mostly Mesopotamian force. With the rest, I'm making some upgrades in Cameria, and Antioch gets the long-awaited conversion of its trade port to a Tier 3 military wharf. Though it will take 10 turns to complete, these upgrades to the admittedly backward Seleukid navy can't come soon enough, as the Romans demonstrate they still have more than enough naval strength to contend with the sum total of our own Mediterranean fleets. Legio I limping back to the contested waters around Syracuse, now supported by Classes 3 and Classes 4. Again, I just don't trust myself enough in these naval battles, so I'm going to take the opportunity to escape, although it could backfire. In succession, both of our navies escaped the action with Classes 3 and Classes 4, moving back to the island. The rebellion at Bosphorus has become a reality, and I'm concerned that they might capture the small settlement of Phanagoria before Hermocrates can reach it as he embarks to return across the strait from Pantikopaon with the Spear of Ares. As the heralds of Triton sail back east to prepare the retrofit of their navy, I'm building up Chilon's navy, the Scylla's terror, in the meantime to contend with any would-be invasions of Greece by the Romans. In the east, the Wisdom of the Goose also get a few additional recruits with the Jaws of Tiamat near full strength. Back in Italia, Hierax crosses the river Arno, and the invasion of Italy has officially begun. The Hawk's Talons assault the unwalled settlement of Arretium, which has the large but weak Roman garrison I've come to expect. It's a similar story to the last battle, albeit to a lesser degree, with the 35% predicted losses being too high for Antiochus Hierax to sustain his assault into Rome. So as before, we'll be fighting this briefly but manually. To some extent, we're fortunate that the Romans have even done us the favor of fighting outside the city so as not to damage the infrastructure. They're setting up at the southern end of a gently undulating landscape with moderate scattered areas of forest. We'll meet them in the clearing at the center of the map, in our usual battle setup with silver shield pikes, flanked by shield bearers with artillery to draw them in, although in a slight twist I've got my silver shield swordsmen hidden in the trees to the west. Unfortunately, the bright silver armor, sparkling shields, and glinting weapons aren't all that well camouflaged even in the dense patch of forest, and the units are almost immediately discovered. It's a lapse that Tiberius Cincinnatus, the governor and garrison commander of the cavalry, takes advantage of very quickly, launching his horsemen right into the Seleukid heavy infantry. On the opposite flank, my Hippocontisti are providing an excellent distraction, magnetically drawing almost half the enemy force in their direction with the javelin harassment. The Syrian and Greek archers are dealing good damage in the center, and my main concern is how to shore up the right flank as I move Antiochus and some shield bearers in that direction. The elephants too rampage through the undergrowth in the western patch of forest, and smash the Italian swordsmen there as their missile infantry frantically rush eastward. Even as my plan for an orderly dismantling of the town garrison has been jettisoned, still there's no immediate cause for concern as several Roman units have already been driven off the battlefield with more to follow as my citizen cavalry emerge from the forest in the enemy rear and prepare to deliver a lethal attack on the Roman missile infantry. We're suffering a few casualties here and there, mostly on the basis of Roman precursor javelins, but the citizen cavalry are dismantling the Italian slingers very rapidly, as you might expect. While the silver shield swordsmen and elephants have by now completely demolished the enemy general and the adjacent swordsmen as Antiochus routs the town guard spearmen, leaving only a couple of engaged Italian sword regiments in the clearing, and the rest of the Roman garrison army fruitlessly chasing after our Hippocontisti. Once the center is cleared of enemies, I'm free to reform my army facing the appropriate direction, and the three remaining garrison regiments seem to sense the inevitable, as one wavers and breaks almost immediately, and the other two intermittently waver until the threat of a citizen cavalry charge scatters them like leaves in the wind before any actual contact has been made. As promised, this was a minor distraction but not a real danger to the elite men of the Hawk's Talons, as we took only 183 casualties, a mere 6% compared to the 35% or roughly 1,000 we would have otherwise suffered. This has given Herax his first foothold into the Italian peninsula, with Rome and Neapolis to the south, and Ariminum separated from us by the spine of the peninsula, the Apennine mountain range. I thought we had moved far away enough from the Roman naval presence in Syracuse, but apparently that's not the case, as Classes 3 and 4 have found their way nearly to the shores of Greece in pursuit of Sylla's terror, who unfortunately have not had the opportunity to finish off their recruitment started during my turn, and they're driven off before the reinforcing ships can arrive from the port. I'm a little bit nervous that my ships have chosen to sail into the Gulf of Corinth, fearing that they may have become trapped there, but fortunately the Romans seem to have exhausted their movement for the turn. On the other hand, we get a more pleasant surprise from the Scythians, who apparently like the Bosphorian Greeks even less than they like us, destroying the Cimmerian rebels with the help of our small garrison at Phanagoria, saving me the trouble of worrying about whether or not I'll lose the settlement next turn. Rumors about Herax's actions in Italy have permeated the empire, and now he has the untrustworthy trait, which should come as no surprise, although for now, his brother seems unwilling to believe them. Continuing the tradition of skullduggery in Cisalpina, Doris tries again to coerce Tiberius Calpurnius at Genua, but this time she gets wounded for her efforts. Herax moves up to the border of Latium, the territory surrounding Rome, but fortifies his army without moving forward yet. I look at some of the available local troops to choose a replacement for my missing regiment, eventually settling on some heavily armed Apulii Extraordinarii, who are a somewhat weak echo of a bygone era in the Roman military, having been replaced with much deadlier legionaries currently in use. Silisterra and Chilon safely backtrack from Corinth to Apollonia, where they enjoy the additional protection of the garrison, while I once again try to build up the fleet, also adding a couple of shield bearers and cavalry to bolster Antigonos Doson's garrison force. Out east, I continue my troop building for Euclid's army, and Seleukos II continues his miserable trek through the snow across the northern shore of the Caspian Sea. With my last bit of wealth for the turn, I can't resist fleshing out Sophocles' Medusa head wielders with some amazing Rhodian slingers, going perhaps a bit overboard in my recruitment. The Romans choose disappointingly but wisely to completely ignore my well-defended settlement of Apollonia, instead targeting the almost completely undefended town of Epidamnos, where I'm forced to cede the city in an auto-resolve. But the Romans have another attack in mind. I had worried that Diogenes would never actually face a Roman in combat, but today is his lucky day. Legio II confronts the Golden Fleece in Africa at Cyrithum, and while we hold a modest edge on the auto-resolve, there's a clear incentive here to fight this battle. Both armies composed of mostly mid-tier but good quality troops, and both generals experienced and dangerous. The road winding through the dry scrubland along the ocean is the site of the showdown, and Diogenes is definitely going to take advantage of his even slight missile superiority, deploying back a bit toward the middle of the deployment zone, with the Ethiopian archers out in front and the Lithobolus behind, while the old general will lead the cavalry on the left wing himself. The Romans have a very balanced setup without any obvious weaknesses as they advance at a long line with interspersed units of spears, cavalry, and missile troops covering one another's deficiencies. Diogenes sweeps out to the left with his cavalry detachment in an effort to find a soft place to strike the Roman advance, but there is none I can discern at the moment. It's just a slow advance in disciplined unison as the Romans near our line, unperturbed by the hail of arrows and hurled ballistic projectiles. This affords Diogenes the opportunity to move cautiously behind their line, but still there's no clear opening for a charge. The less numerous Roman cavalry have moved out to either side of our line, and as their force spreads out, they're threatening to flank and/or engulf our more concentrated position. Fortunately, my hoplites are able to catch the cavalry before they can move in and disrupt my weaker missile or artillery regiments, and at the same time the Legio II general, Quintus Maximus, tests the waters against my left-hand phalangite wall, and even the elite cavalry bodyguard suffers against the cruel Macedonian sarissas. Those smaller skirmishes underway, the main engagement now takes place with the Roman infantry line crashing into our phalangitae, as my thoracitae and royal peltasts begin moving around the flanks and tossing their javelins when able. Suddenly, the only free cavalry units on the battlefield, and now in perfect position, Diogenes and his new light Egyptian horsemen ride down the Camillan slinger levies in the rear of the Roman assault. My royal peltasts on the right, in the meantime, have not managed to successfully find their way around the edge of the main line without becoming entangled, which is a common issue, so I resign them to supporting the hoplitae on that flank, while the thoracitae on the opposite end of the line also rush to fill any gaps in the line and reinforce the phalangitae, who are actually doing fairly well. Quintus Maximus withdraws from the melee to attempt to counter our Egyptian cavalry marauding through the Camillan slingers, but his weakened bodyguard does essentially no damage in its brief engagement with our cavalry, who continue their work unmolested. The 3 Egyptian cavalry regiments are now finishing up their work on the slinger levies, but Diogenes has long since demolished the unit he was targeting with his stronger heteroi lancers, and he turns his attention now to one of his favorite tactics of slamming his cavalry at full speed into the already engaged enemy infantry, second only to his preference for bombardment from a safe distance.
Another near miss. Hephaestus has seen fit to spare my life again, but this is another clear reminder for a suitably harsh reprimand for the artillery commander. Companions, pull back. These Romans are losing, but they're stubborn, and we're likely to be pulverized by our own ballista if we get bogged down in melee. You there, Roman, do you speak Greek? Your slingers are dying, and look at my ballista smashing your infantry. Be reasonable and run for your life. Do you understand what I'm saying? Diogenes has bigger stones than you. Make sure you tell your commander, your governor, the consul, your wife and your children, Diogenes has the biggest stones.
Even before the involvement of our cavalry in the melee, we're holding a strong upper hand, with favorable matchups with our spearmen fending off the enemy cavalry and Thracitai legionaries carving their way through Italian spearmen. The typical superiority of Roman over Greek army composition now turned on its head, with the Roman force composed primarily of spear-type Italian militia supported by a few triarii. This legion apparently not having gotten the Marian memo. Diogenes smashes the remnants of Quintus Maximus's retinue, shattering the general's bodyguard and augmenting the shock of the rout with his general shouts, causing several more units to waver. Gradually, the Thracitai and the royal peltasts overpower their foes, and the pincers of each flank begin closing on the Roman infantry line in a gradually but unrelentingly tightening vice grip. Even a desperate but laudable attempt by the weakened Equites to reach our Lathabulos crew is intercepted by our agile Egyptian cavalry, and with the Roman cavalry, missile support, and general in retreat, their infantry had been left for the wolf in golden sheep's clothing to devour. The Roman triarii held out for quite some time near the end of the battle, but as you can see, they didn't garner any more kills than the rest of the Roman infantry. We took 500 losses out of 3,500 men, many of these being wear and tear on the lightly armored Egyptian cavalry and some expected losses in the Sarissa phalanx. Quintus Maximus escapes with his life, and a handful of slingers and triarii, but little else, scurrying away along the desert road to the west. Once we're back in our own turn, Diogenes quickly gives chase and hunts down and destroys Legio II, the 5th Roman legion to face defeat at Seleukid hands, and the 4th to be completely annihilated. Diogenes follows up his victory with an assault on nearby Roman-held Euphranta, and again our ability to swiftly auto-resolve the fight is severely handicapped by the expected losses of over 50%. We'll be fighting this one manually, although you've seen this sort of battle many times by now, and I'll try to summarize it a bit more briefly. I would be very surprised if the garrison did anything other than rush our formation with the Lathabulos present, and as such we're setting up the pike wall and archers to receive their charge. They do make a move to exit the town, although they take a bit more circuitous approach than I'd expected, marching along a parallel street to the eastern town exit rather than coming directly south. They're doing this in clear view of our army, so I try to rearrange my line to surround them as they emerge, swapping my cavalry over to the left side and angling the pike wall obliquely to face the town exit, while I try to get my swordsmen over to the western enemy flank. We're not quite quick enough to get completely set up before they come into range, but it makes little difference. Our legionaries and royal peltasts are more than a match for anything in this garrison, and could likely take them on without any assistance from the rest of the army, so in they rush as my archers and artillery bombard the dense cluster of Romans. The Roman slingers have moved back slightly into the town street, which is preventing me from approaching them directly, so Diogenes leads his cavalry into town via the southern exit to approach the enemy formation from the rear, while my legionaries and hoplites squeeze through the narrow gap to encircle the western enemy flank. With the Roman missile infantry pursued and then destroyed by the Egyptian light cavalry, the rest of the Roman infantry formation has been completely surrounded and gradually fall to the massed Seleukid assault. Their main garrison defense dealt with, there remains just one small inconvenience before we can claim the town, and that is the single remaining garrison navy unit yet to land, the naval captain Gnaeus Basilis and his quinquereme. My Ethiopian archers pull out their pitch-soaked arrows, set the tips alight, and then pour a rain of fire onto the ship and its 5 banks of oarsmen. The fire damage is substantial, causing the ship to catch fire just as the crew are frantically beaching the craft, and although the Romans manage to scramble off the ship before it sinks, they've done so to escape the rising flames rather than face the terrifying Seleukid general Diogenes, and the battle is immediately won. In keeping with the theme of the battles this episode, our result was much more acceptable than what was predicted by the auto-resolve, and that will enable Diogenes to continue his conquest across Africa, and at his advanced age he has little time to waste. Much of our wealth for this turn is devoted to the conversions at Euphranta, which is already a Tier 3 settlement, although I changed the city center over to a farming infrastructure and the port to a trade hub. Our other problem currently is the Roman capture of Epidamnos, with Legio I as well as classes 3 and 4 guarding the settlement. Antigonos Doson cannot by himself take on the small Roman legion and 2 fleets, nor can Chilon handle Legio III and Legio IV at sea. Instead, after having encircled the city with Antigonos Doson, Chilon deftly slips around the Roman blockade and assaults the city port directly, and our combined forces are now strong enough to defeat the Romans. We have a modest advantage on the balance bar with a high chance of victory, although we're predicted to lose about 50% of our force. I decided to take the auto-resolve here, expecting that an expulsion of the Romans would allow Antigonos Doson plenty of time to replenish his army, although I was not expecting what came next, although there is some logic to it. Our losses are borne almost entirely by Sylla's terror, and the entire fleet, ships, crews, and commander are lost in the battle. I need a new commander of the Apollonian Navy, a job that seemingly no one would want at this point, but Adelphia steps into the oft-vacated shoes of the admiral of Sylla's terror. With the Romans back on their heels seemingly, and Antiochus Hierax preparing to put a knife into the heart of their empire, we return briefly to the Eastern Theater, which has been quiet for some time now. Seleukos II has made his way up the Caucasus and across the upper margin of the Caspian Sea, and he's arrived in the capital of the Scythian kingdom of the Roxolanians. There can be no discussion, compromise, or resistance. We need this land to secure our eastern border and shut in the dangerous lurking Parthians and the horse lords of Cath. It's a bit dangerous, but I decide in this case to take the substantial losses of the auto-resolve, expecting that we can quickly and safely replenish our army behind the walls of a new provincial capital. As a result of this victory, our Imperium level has reached the pinnacle level of 8, granting us an additional agent in each category, although Eurydice's agent conversions have already met or exceeded these limits in some cases, while our number of provincial edicts has gone up to 9. We'll need to take advantage of each of these soon to counterbalance the substantial faction-wide penalties imposed by such a high Imperium level. Antilochus, having received word of Seleukos' capture of Dax, then reignites the war with Parthia, moving west across the border and directly into Nisa, the Parthian capital. Again, we're given a good chance on the auto-resolve, but high losses predicted. I'm going to fight this one, in part so as not to cripple Antilochus and Euclid in their conquest of the dangerous Parthians, but also to see how Antilochus' army of Mesopotamian and Indo-Iranian troops perform. We're battling the large garrison just north of the town in an area of scrubland and desert, and the melee infantry engagement will be spearmen versus spearmen. My Akkadian elite infantry will form the center of our line, as they have large shields and heavy armor, and they'll be flanked on either side by the Shipri Tukul Mesopotamian heavy spearmen, preceded by Mesopotamian archers and followed by the artillery and the Indo-Iranian peltas, and Antilochus himself, while our Indo-Iranian cavalry will move out wide to the right. The incredibly long enemy line threatens to envelop our smaller formation, so I've repositioned my Shipri Tukul spearmen on the left flank to guard our Lathabalos, while our peltas move out to the right to face off against the Parthian garrison captain, by whom our cavalry ride on their flanking maneuver, although the Indo-Iranians find no clear opening for a safe charge against so many enemy spearmen. Surprisingly, although the Parthians approach our line, they don't mindlessly charge once their missile infantry are in range, instead holding their position to let their archers and bow-equipped cavalry trade fire with our own outnumbered Mesopotamian archers. This seems to work to some extent, and very quickly I've got a unit of archers in retreat, with another not far behind, and I'm forced to rush my spearmen forward to force the Parthians to commit. Braving the hail of Parthian arrows, my soldiers make it to the enemy line more or less intact, thanks to their shields and armor, and once engaged, things get a bit more under control. Though initially outnumbered, the elite Akkadian infantry are stalwart combatants and excellent for pinning multiple units, while the addition of Antilochus' elite sword regiment and a rear charge by a unit of Indo-Iranian cavalry causes the Parthian center to rapidly disintegrate. On the extreme right side, things are going as planned, as my peltas dismantle the enemy captain's regiment from a safe distance with their javelins, and nearby, a multicultural force of Akkadians, Indo-Iranians, and Mesopotamians smash apart the Parthian northern flank. Within a few moments of beginning the engagement, only the Parthian southern flank closest to the town remains, and with our force in great shape other than the initial losses of the archer units, I'm free to charge in with everything available to finish off the weak Parthian garrison spearmen and lone unit of Parthian horse archers. A very nice victory for Antilochus under the circumstances, and while the enemy posed little challenge, I was pleasantly surprised to see their appropriate use of their initial missile superiority, although their arrows were ultimately of little use against the thick Akkadian armor. Following this victory and the elevation of Antilochus to the second rank, I move Euclid in to assault the next settlement of Amul, which features a small garrison but a tiny associated garrison army. I decided to take the auto-resolve in this fight for the sake of convenience, and we wind up with some moderately heavy losses, but with all of our regiments still intact on the whole. Parthia has now been forced into two small patches of territory in southern Scythia and Transoxania, divided by allied territory in northern Chorasmia held by the Daha. Figuring they might want to reconsider their role as a Seleukid satrapy, I offer the Parthians a way out of the war, but they're still too proud to accept subjugation without further fighting. We'll leave the Parthians for now to consider their imminent demise, although Seleukos II's surprise strike in the north has no doubt angered the other tribes of the steppe, including Royal Scythia and our allies the Arsi. Diogenes continues his single-handed supremacy of desert warfare, ranging from Arabia to Africa, and Antigonos Doson frets over the defense of Macedonia from unremitting reprisals by the Romans, who seek any opportunity to lash out at the Seleukid Empire and re-establish the legitimacy of Antiochus Theos' widow Berenike and her son, before the sword of Hierax descends on Rome itself.